It's like, where is he? Bon, alors, bienvenue à la conférence de Jules WHITE de l'Université Vanderbilt. Il va parler de l'IA générative, que son titre est le l'IA générative réinvente l'informatique et l'innovation. C'est ambitieux. Il est professeur d'informatique à l'Université Vanderbilt et conseiller principal du chancelier pour l'IA générative. Il dirige l'initiative de l'Université Vanderbilt sur l'avenir de l'apprentissage et de l'IA générative. Ses recherches couvrent la cybersécurité, l'information mobile et en nuage, ainsi que l'IA avec plus de, etc. Alors, with that, I've now introduced you in French. Everybody else has seen your summary in English, so I invite I welcome Jules WHITE to Montreal virtually, and I invite him to take over.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I start all my talks the same way because I apologize for a second while I move Zoom out of the way. What I tell people is that if you had stopped me on the street November 1st of 2022, and you'd said this thing called ChatGPT is going to come out at the end of the month, and here's what it's going to be able to do, I would have told you, trust me, I'm a professor in computer science. I will not live to see that level of advance in computing. And then at the end of the month, something came out that I did not believe would exist in my lifetime. Like, it fundamentally changes computing in a way that I didn't think would be possible while I was alive. And I think it's been the most exciting thing that I've seen, but I've also believe it's something that people still sort of fundamentally misunderstand how big of a transformation it is. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is really trying to understand through simple examples how big of an impact this technology is going to have and how broad the impact is going to be. Because a lot of times when people start talking about AI, because it's talked about as AI and not generative AI typically in the news and in the public, you talk to people and they view it as something that's like this thing that's out there that doesn't impact them. Like, that's what computer scientists do, or that's what programmers do. Like, it doesn't affect me in my life. And I've heard that it's coming for my job, but I don't really know what that means. And so I do a lot of time thinking about like how to really explain the impact and how do we teach people how to use it. So very early on, when I became tremendously excited that everything I know to some degree in computer science was about to die, and this totally new world of computer science was about to, be born out of what I'd been doing for, most of my career. So I've been writing software. That was a big part of what I did with software engineering and cybersecurity. And when I started looking at this, this is the end of the world as we know it in terms of the production of software and how we create it, what software means, how it works. Everything is going to change. And so I really started looking at it. And at first, it's a little bit of this is just tremendous fear of like, what does this mean for my career? That everything I know is about to end. Um, and at first I wanted to resist and say, no, it's not good enough. It has mistakes, it has flaws. And I very quickly came around to it. And I came around because I was having a discussion with my father, who's in his 80s, and we were interactively over the phone. He would say, now ask ChatGPT to tell you this or do this. And we were experimenting together. And we asked the question, what would have to change in the world if we didn't have odd numbers? And it gave this incredible answer. And that was the first moment where I realized, like, this is something different. It doesn't do computing the way that I thought before. And then I became really invested in trying to understand, what does this technology mean? And, maybe it's much more capable than I thought. And so as part of that, I went and created a first course, just sort of like I started doing a lot of research, really diving into trying to understand the capabilities and how do we turn them into building blocks that people could use, really inspired by my work in software engineering and software design patterns. And so I built a initial course on prompt engineering, which really took off. I have about 600,000 students in all of my generative AI classes. My biggest one is on prompt engineering. But one of the things that happened along the way there was that as the course exploded, I started getting, contacted by all these companies that were using generative AI, that were building things with generative AI. And I started off sort of looking at it from the prompt engineering perspective, kind of thinking of it as the programming of the future. And really, over time, I became sort of my eyes open to how much bigger and wider the impact is going to be, because of all the inbound and all the different ways that I saw companies were using it. And a lot of what you're going to be seeing is sort of like examples that I've collected to kind of represent the things that I see that are happening in industry that are really impactful, that are going to make a big difference. So to get started, I'm sure everybody knows what a prompt is, but I like to kind of create a mental model of what a prompt is and how generative AI works that you can kind of use throughout this presentation. So generative AI works kind of like text messaging. So you can go in and you can type in a message to your friend, you can send it off to your friend, and your friend can text you a reply, or they can send you back a video in response, or they can record some audio, or you could text your friend a task, like go and buy milk for me. And your friend could go off and perform that task and then tell you the result. Yeah, I bought milk and it costs $3.85 or whatever milk costs. And um, generative AI works essentially the same way, except when we type in a message, we give it a fancy name, we call it a prompt, and we send it off to the generative AI, and the generative AI may go and text us back something, it may go generate a video, or it may go perform a task on our behalf and give us a response. And these are all, things that you could ask generative AI to do. Write a poem about the French Revolution, create a Pokemon game for my child. Um, and if you had the right type of friend, they could respond to one of these messages. The beautiful thing about generative AI is that no matter what you send it, it will respond. And often this leads to what people talk about as hallucination, when it gets too creative and you didn't really want it to be so creative. And people talk about this as this major problem in generative AI. I think it's the most important feature of generative AI. I'm going to talk a lot about that. But I think if it didn't have this creative aspect that leads to hallucination, or what we term hallucination, then we wouldn't care about generative AI at all in many cases. So the very first thing that I usually try to tell people about generative AI, and it's a mistake that I see made over and over when I start interacting with people who haven't done much with it, is they treat it kind of like internet search. So they ask it a question, they get an answer, and the answer is either right or wrong. And if it's wrong, it means that generative AI made a mistake and it's not good enough yet, and then you should throw it away. And I think this is the wrong way of thinking about generative AI and how you should use it. You really want to use it to iteratively solve problems in conversation. So you go and you develop a concept over, a series of turns in a conversation. You solve a problem, sort of collaboratively. But this is sort of the model that you should think about. And it really changes how generative AI works and performs when you start thinking about it this way. So we're going to start off with a really simple task. And the task is, please create a meal plan for my family that is based on a fusion of food from Ethiopia and Uzbekistan. I want to eat keto and up to 2,000 calories per day. Pick dishes where the ingredients are easy to get from an average US grocery store. So this is an easy task for ChatGPT from January of 2023, which is ancient history from models perspective. And it's something that I don't think that there's a person in Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, or probably the US, that can do it as well or as fast as ChatGPT. So what does it say? Here's a sample meal plan. Breakfast: scrambled eggs with sauteed onions, tomatoes, and Ethiopian berbere spice mix. And then notice what it does, in parentheses, made with chili powder, paprika, garlic powder, ginger, cumin, and coriander. And it's signaling to us these are ingredients that you can get at an average US grocery store. Berbere spice mix is not this mystical thing. You can procure it from a grocery store. Now, it is understanding, is what I say, and I use the words understand. It understands the concept of average US grocery store. And a lot of people take issue with this when I say it understands the concept of average US grocery store. So they say, does it really understand? And as a computer scientist, and particularly somebody with a software engineering background, I say, I don't care if it truly understands. What I now have is a computational tool that allows me to compute answers that approximate an understanding of an average US grocery store. I don't care if it really understands or not necessarily. I care that I have this approximation tool that works most of the time, because I've always had lots of approximation tools in computing that work most of the time, but not always. And that's okay with me, because now I could begin building on top of that. And we never had anything remotely close to this, from my perspective, in computing. Now, a lot of people look at this and they say, you know, you said 2,000 calories and it failed on the most basic thing, which is serving sizes. So if I really care about serving sizes, I just follow up in the conversation. I'm iteratively solving the problem. And I say, can you give me an approximate serving size for myself for each dish? And then it comes back and it says, okay, now I have 2 eggs, half a cup of onions, half a cup of tomatoes, 1 teaspoon of Barbera spice mix. And so when we approach it, and we approach it in this one-off way where you ask it a question, it's either right or wrong, you know, I say it's like somebody handing Michelangelo a new hammer, and he walks up to the stone, and he whacks the stone with the hammer, and then he looks at it and he's like, oh, it's not a beautiful sculpture. And he throws the hammer down on the ground. He's like, it's a terrible tool. Why would anybody use it? Now, I think we're getting past this, but Michelangelo is never going to just hit the stone once. He's going to continue to chisel away and refine with that tool, but he's also going to understand that his skill with the tool is equally important. And we have to approach generative AI like that. Not only is it something that requires iterative, you know, work with the tool, but it also requires us to improve our skills, to improve our quality of our outputs of what we're getting. Now, we could keep refining this. Some people might say half a cup of onions is too many carbs for somebody who's keto. Yeah, and we could refine the macronutrients, but I'm going to take it in a different direction. And the direction I'm going to take the conversation is I'm going to solve a marketing problem that I have in my household. And my marketing problem is, how am I going to get my son, he was 9 when I started doing this example, he's now 11, but how am I going to get my 9-year-old at the time to try this stuff? And so I followed up in the conversation, and I say, my son is 9. Sometimes he won't try new dishes. To make this culinary adventure more fun for him, can you create a short Pokemon battle story to go with each dish? I'll read the stories with him before dinner to get him excited about trying the new food. Make sure the story ends with a cliffhanger that will motivate him to try the food. And what does ChatGPT say? Story. Pikachu and his friends were exploring the wilds of Ethiopia when they were suddenly ambushed by a group of sneaky Pokemon thieves. As they raced through the dense jungle, they stumbled upon a hidden cave filled with treasure. And then it goes on and it says, in the end, they emerged victorious, but not before the dragon left a fiery spice that imbued their breakfast eggs with a flavorful kick. Can you help Pikachu and his friends defeat the Barbera dragon and enjoy this spicy breakfast? So I don't know about you, but I'm not very good at, you know, keto, Ethiopian, Uzbek meal plans that work with an average US grocery store. I'm really not good at writing Pokemon battle stories that end with cliffhangers to motivate a 9-year-old and solve the marketing problem. Yep. Is there a question? Okay.
No.
Okay. So, you know, this is doing things that just did not exist in computing before. Like we did not have computing systems that could do things like this, that could write something to convince a 9-year-old to eat a dish, understand the dish, the concept, weave in other concepts, and end with a cliffhanger and follow that instruction and do it extremely well. Nothing like this existed in computing. And you just start thinking about the domains that that's going to impact, like marketing, you know, advertising, all kinds of different things. And then I was thinking about, well, what else can I do to make this more interesting for my son and to get him more engaged in this whole idea? And I thought, well, we always talk to him at dinner about what he's learning in school, and he loves math and he loves to play math games on an iPad. I wonder if I could get ChatGPT to play a math game with him. And so I followed up and I said, I'd like you to play a math game with my 9-year-old to teach him about division with fractions and nutrition. Ask him questions one at a time involving Pokemon and these topics and make it into a game. And this is starting to use concepts from prompt engineering about how you structure the conversation to solve different types of problems. So what does ChatGPT say? Question 1. Pikachu and his friends are planning a meal that includes half a cup of cooked rice, but they need to divide it evenly among 3 Pokemon. How much rice will each Pokemon get? And then what does it do? It waits. It waits for his response because it understands the concept of a game and it understands that it's his turn to provide the answer. And then when he puts in the answer, which is 1/6, it says, good job. It works out the math for him and it goes on to the next question. Ash wants to make a smoothie. And if you think about it, what I just did is with like a few sentences, I created a personalized educational game for my son that will go on quizzing him with questions about Pokemon and fractions in nutrition for basically as long as he wants to do it. Now, as a software engineer, I could go and write a piece of software that delivers this educational experience, but it's not like 2 or 3 sentences. It's probably hours or days of my time. And then I still got to go and create all the questions and all the content. And with just 2 or 3 sentences, I've got an infinite, essentially personal educational game for my son. And that's absolutely going to transform the types of things that we can do in education, training, all kinds of things. But it also shows us something interesting, and that's that we think about asking these models questions, telling them what to do, but they can just as easily ask us questions and tell us what to do, or tell a computer what to do, and begin driving and having agency. And this is the basis of AI agents, is when they start taking over the conversation and start deciding, who is being asked the questions and what they're being asked or what they're being told to do. And then finally, as a computer scientist, I thought, well, this is all great that he can play the game in ChatGPT. Can it turn it into real software? So I just followed up in the conversation and I said, let's create code for this in Python. I gave it some constraints on what I wanted using my knowledge of software engineering. And it goes through and it generates the code. This is a snippet of it. And then this is the game running in a browser. He could play it on an iPad or a laptop. And so through this conversation, I went and I sort of seamlessly explored this meal plan. And then I turned it into marketing material personalized for my son. And then I turned that into an interactive game. And then I turned it into, actual software. And absolutely nothing that we had in computing was remotely this fluid in terms of allowing me to explore ideas and realize different concepts and manifest it in software and marketing plans for a child and all this other stuff. And it's going to be completely transformative on our world. So I want to now show you some concrete examples of the types of things that we're doing at Vanderbilt, just like really, concrete things that we're doing in the operations at Vanderbilt. So this is the Vanderbilt travel and business expense policy, and it is a 17-page PDF. And I used to joke with people, I've had like many expenses rejected because of this thing, and yet I've never bothered to read it. And that used to be true until I uploaded it to ChatGPT one day. And I said, please read the provided document so you can answer questions about it. And then I asked it a question that looks like the questions I actually ask. Let's assume I'm in a foreign country traveling in a taxi and it breaks down on the way to an important meeting. Can I get reimbursed if I pay someone to drive me on the back of their motorcycle to the meeting? Assume they were a private citizen. What does ChatGPT say? Based on the information provided in the document. Now, I think we're beginning to come past this as a world, but for a long time, there's been all this discussion of training models. Oh, it doesn't have your private data. You have to go and train it. You have to go fine tune it for it to do anything. And that's really not the case. Most of these models are so sophisticated, you simply give them your data as input, and it goes and performs computation on it. And you have to start thinking about it like a CPU. The model itself is essentially like a CPU. You feed it data and instructions, but you just put them together in a prompt, and then it can go and compute on it. So based on the information provided in the document, the university requires travelers to select the most reasonable and economical form of transportation. That's true, direct statement out of the document. Non-conventional transportation options are not explicitly mentioned. That's also true. Vanderbilt does not have a separate policy on ride sharing. That's a direct statement out of the document. Given these points, it seems plausible that in an emergency situation where no other reasonable and economical form of transportation is available, the cost of transportation by a private citizen's motorcycle might be considered an allowable expense. However, the university's policy does not explicitly state this, and reimbursement may be subject to review. So I presented this in front of all the chief business officers at the university, and they all nodded their heads, and they're all like, that's absolutely right. It might be allowed, and we will review it. So they were very happy with this result. But if you think about it, like the complexity of what was just done, that's really amazing. we performed a computation on a document, on the ideas in a document. Now, it may appear that we've had computing technology like this for a while. If you think about things like internet search, it kind of worked like this. You'd put in something that looked like a question and you get a bunch of text that looks like it answers the question. It's a very different thing to understand the document well enough to apply it to something.
Okay, now I have to ask you a question because
Yeah.
you've used the you word several
Uh-huh.
times that you said, I don't care.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by the you word?
I think about the U word as like I think in terms of like computing and operations. So I can ask it to perform an operation that, and I think this is a great question. What does it really mean? And I don't generally give a definition to it, so I'm gonna do my best on the fly. I think that it means that, from my perspective, it performs the operation, um, approximately correct, given the information that I gave it. It's like at least in the ballpark. That's the way that I think of it. That it has that there is a plausible like mapping. If I think of it almost like a function, that it took my input and it mapped it to a plausible space, based on what I gave it. So that's kind of my rough answer, but I don't think it understands it in the sense of, you know, I had a great discussion with somebody the other day who said, we were talking about like, I mean, it basically is, learning from language as opposed from learning from experience with the environment, and like it's learning in a totally different way than we do. So it really understands in a different way. So I don't think it understands in the way a human does, but it understands in some um, way that creates a useful sort of computational ability that I can use. Does
Here's
that
a
make
shorter way to say it. Say that you're giving an operational definition of understanding, and the operation is if it does something with what you said that you find right, then it's got an operational understanding of what it is that you were saying.
I think so. I don't I'm I'm somebody who is happy with imperfection. So I would love for it to be perfect, but I am excited by my new imperfect tools, even if they might not always work, if that makes sense. But I'm also a big proponent of human in the loop because of the um, imperfection in a lot of the tools, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. No more interruptions. Go ahead.
Oh, no, good. So going back to understanding, I'll think of it as like a computational operational understanding. So in the same conversation, I followed up and I give it a rental car receipt. And I say, please analyze the attached receipt and let me know if it complies. And it comes back, and I'm going to draw your attention to the highlighted portion at the bottom, collision damage waiver. For domestic travel, the CDW should be declined as rental vehicles are fully insured through Vanderbilt's insurance portfolio. The receipt shows a charge for CDW, which may not comply if this is domestic travel. So it understood in some operational way the policy well enough to determine that the receipt was not in compliance and why. Now, for me, this is transformative in computing because, like, to build software to do this would not be just me. It would be like me plus a team of people probably for years to try to approach the level of auditing that this just did. And all we had to do to get there was say, take the document and apply it to the receipt. And if you think about this as an abstraction in computing, we now have a new capability, which is take a document and apply it. Take a best practices and apply it. And that's something that anybody can do from any domain. In fact, most people, most businesses, most departments, they spend all this time writing policies, procedures, best practices, guides, all kinds of things. And suddenly we have a pathway to turn those into software essentially, to take the document and say, apply it to this. And that is transformative in software. And at the same time, it can do it often in a way that's better than anything we could have built with the prior computing technologies that we had. This is the Vanderbilt Instructional Enrollment Report. It's a 20-page PDF of these tables. And so in the past, if I wanted to do work on this to do some type of analysis, I would probably be copying and pasting out of this PDF into a tool like Excel, because none of our software tools talk to each other very well. They all have weird formats. And then I'd go into Excel and do some work with it. So I'm going to upload it to ChatGPT. And this used to be a separate sort of function called code interpreter, and then they renamed it advanced data analysis. Now it's just baked into ChatGPT. You don't even realize that it's there. Uploaded it to ChatGPT, and I said, please extract each page of this PDF as plain text. So I'm essentially asking it to perform a computation, to do something that Adobe Acrobat would have done in the past. And it goes and it splits the PDF apart into separate pages, and it gives me links to download each page as plain text. So I've described to it what I want in words, and it's translated what I've asked it into computation. Now, we had tools like Adobe Acrobat that could do things like that. So let's do something more interesting. I did a little prompt engineering in the conversation, and then I said, turn it into Excel. And it goes and it converts it into Excel. And then I can download it and open it in Excel. And it begins solving a problem I have with existing software systems, which is they're very brittle. They don't share data very well. They don't talk to each other. And now I have something that can begin moving data between them. But what's interesting is, as I was going through this conversation, I thought, why would I move data between those two systems when I can just stay right here and follow up in the conversation and say something like this: display 4 interesting visualizations of this data. And it comes back and it shows me these visualizations. I could go back and I could say, make them black and gold, Vanderbilt's colors, filter it this way, do this. You notice I didn't even tell it what I wanted visualized. I just said interesting. And it translated that into computation. And now I can focus my time on thinking about, what do I want to see? How do I want to filter it? What styles of visualizations, what colors, all these types of things. And as fast and as fluidly as I can think through what I want, it will translate it into computation to make it happen. And then I thought, well, you know what I really hate is I really hate turning all this stuff into PowerPoint. So I wonder if it can do PowerPoint. So I followed up in the conversation. I uploaded my slide template. I said, save each visualization as an image, then insert each of these images as separate slides into the attached PowerPoint. And I gave it some formatting information. And I told it to put a text box next to each visualization describing what it was. And it goes and it does some work and it generates the PowerPoint file and gives me a link to download it. And then this is the PowerPoint file open in PowerPoint. It's taken each visualization, it's made it into a separate slide. It's put a text box next to it describing what the visualization shows. And now I can focus my time thinking about, well, what do I want to tell in this presentation? What's the important story that I want to do? And not messing around with, like, how do I get all these things cut and pasted into slides and format it? Now, this is really exciting. The way that I can go and fluidly work with computation through language, have it do real computations that turn into different tools, allow all these tools to work together, but it's way more transformative and a way that we should be talking about every single day. This should have been in the news as like the headline news story of the year, in my opinion. And I want to give you kind of a visual image of what happened in this conversation that was so transformative. So I want you to imagine you grab a shovel and you go into your backyard, and right before you're about to dig, your shovel looks down and sees that there's a rock in the way. Your shovel jumps out of your hands. Your shovel builds a pickaxe. Your shovel uses the pickaxe it built to break up the rock, and then your shovel jumps back in your hands and you continue digging as if nothing happened. And that's exactly what happened in this conversation. Is ChatGPT built itself a tool. It used its own tool to overcome an obstacle. It kept using its tool and fixing its tool and iterating on its own tool until it got the right result that it wanted. And then it handed back the thing that I'd asked for, in this case, the PowerPoint. That is, we now have software that can build its own tools. It can anticipate needs and build tools on the fly, and it can use its own tools that it builds. So I like showing this with an older interface to ChatGPT, because they used to make this much more obvious, and they had these big gray boxes that would pop up. And it's the box that says finished working. And that was ChatGPT building itself a tool. And if you clicked on the gray box, it would show you the tool it built. And the tool it built is software. When I said, I want you to turn each of these visualizations into an image, and then I want you to save each one to a file, and then I want you to go and put them into PowerPoint and make each one a separate slide, it wrote a Python program to do that on the fly. It said, look, I'm a model. I can't create PowerPoint. I can generate tokens, but I know how to generate tokens for Python, and then I know how to execute that Python, and I can look at the result of that execution and determine if it's right or wrong, and I can edit the Python code if there's a mistake and keep doing it until it's right. And that's what it did. And so we have, you think about it, like chimpanzees started using blades of grass to extract termites from termite mounds, and it was huge headline news in the world. Animals can build tools and use them like humans. Amazing result. We have systems now that can build their own tools in the form of software that I showed the code for this to my PhD level class in software engineering with AI. And I said, okay, if I gave you 30 minutes, I just told you the task, I didn't show you this code, how many of you are going to be able to find all the APIs and write all this from scratch in 30 minutes? And basically no hands went up. And it's doing this on the fly behind the scenes. It's basically translating our goals and ideas into computation, in this case, by writing and executing code autonomously. And ChatGPT is actually an AI agent now. People think of it as just like a model, but much more is going on behind the scenes right now. And it's actually taking its own actions and doing things. So two things, sort of really fundamental, interesting things are happening in computing right now. One is that this stuff has just fundamentally unique computational abilities. You know, that understanding, operational understanding that we talked about of arbitrary documents, or something that, you know, creating stuff that ends with a cliffhanger to motivate a 9-year-old. Like, these are just unusual computational abilities that we didn't have before. And two, it's a totally new interface to computing, right? It's translating my goals and desires into computation. And you take these two things and you put it together, and you have an absolute revolution in everything that's going on in computing. And we're at the very beginning of that. Like, we're not at peak AI. We're at the beginning of the transformation of everything that we do in computing because of these capabilities. Now, all kinds of stuff will happen in AI too, but the impact on computing itself is going to be wild. So what do we need to learn about this? You know, and there's sort of this belief it's just a bunch of text, you don't need to learn anything. And I think this is incorrect. You know, a lot of people are like, you don't need to learn prompt engineering. You know, all this prompt engineering stuff's going to go, it's all going to away. And I'd say, yeah, maybe, but I don't think it's very likely, because if you look at how people use it, most people use this stuff incredibly suboptimally. They go and use it like internet search because that's their mental model of how you solve problems with a text box using a computer. Or they go and they use it with, you know, misconceptions or the wrong way, or they don't know the capabilities are there. And you really have to begin teaching people the building blocks, is my perspective, to see them able to really use it well. So, kind of give you my perspective on the building blocks. You know, intuitively, this is a rough approximation of how a lot of these LLMs were trained, is they were taught to predict the next word in a sentence. So they'd show it Mary had a little, it'd predict lamb, they'd try to get it to predict lamb, they'd show it Mary had a little lamb, they'd try to get it to predict its, and so on and so forth, but on huge volumes of text. So over time, it learns how the patterns in the left-hand side influence the next word should come. And the left-hand side is essentially our prompt, and the right-hand side is essentially the words that it's predicting. So when it looks like ChatGPT is typing an answer. So what really matters here is it pays attention to the patterns in our language. And so one of the things that's of interest to me are, what are patterns in our language that it pays attention to that we can teach people, because they have interesting computational, you know, effects that we can then leverage to solve problems. And so I call these prompt patterns. This is kind of inspired by my software design patterns. And it sounds complicated, but we use patterns in our language all the time to solve problems. So if you want to write a formal letter, you say, "Dear so-and-so, comma," and there's a purpose to that pattern. Dear indicates respect. You've got their name, so you know who it's addressed to. You've got the comma, so that you separate it from the body of the letter. And we can do simple things like that and teach people simple building blocks like that. And then it transforms what they can do. So one of my favorite ones that we wrote about early on is the persona pattern. And basically, in the real world, we solve all kinds of problems, not by knowing how to solve them ourselves, but by knowing who to go talk to. So if I have a question about nutrition, I go and talk to a nutritionist. I don't know how they'll arrive at the answer. I don't know what format they'll give it to me in, but I know that's who I go talk to. Or if I have a question about my taxes here in the US, I go talk to the Internal Revenue Service. I don't know how they'll arrive at their answer. I don't know how they'll give me the output, but that's who I talk to. And we've never been able to really do something like that in computing. And now we can with the persona pattern. You simply say, act as a nutritionist or act as the IRS, and it changes the reasoning and output and format of the model. So I'm going to give you an example of this. My wife is a speech language pathologist and she works for the national school system. So she'll test kids typically when they're 3 to see if they need special education plans. And so I'm going to tap into ChatGPT 3.5. This is very old, and using this persona. So act as a speech language pathologist. I'm going to tell you what a 3-year-old said, and you'll write an assessment for me. The child said, I need way woy. So I tried to capture what my son sounded like at this time in text. So it says consonant errors. It seems that the child is having difficulty with the production of some consonantless sounds. The child said mead instead of need and woy instead of toy, assuming the intended words were need and toy. This indicates that the child may be experiencing difficulty with the production and differentiation of these consonant sounds. Syllable structure. The child's production of the word way may indicate some difficulty with the correct syllable structure. It is possible the child intended to say play but produced way instead when suggests a substitution of the initial consonant cluster PL with a single consonant W. So notice what I didn't ask it for. I didn't ask it for consonant cluster reduction or any of this stuff. I just said act as a speech language pathologist, and it changed how it computed the answer, how it responded, the formatting of the answer, everything. Now, I don't think we need to replace speech language pathologists. My family is invested in this not happening. And there's also, I think, a mistake in this, subtle little mistake, but overall, it's really good approximation of how a speech pathologist would go and analyze this speech. All these things are real, and we tapped into it just by giving it a persona. A persona becomes a new abstraction in computing that we can build on top of. And then we have to start thinking about it. And there's interesting research that says, depending on the type of task, you actually improve reasoning if you pull in the right type of persona, all kinds of interesting things. But this is a totally wild new area of computing. Now, one of the other things that's interesting to me as we start thinking about personas, one of the powerful things you can do is you can go and look at like a policy from a particular persona. Like imagine that you're a faculty member, act as a faculty member. The university is going to raise the cost to park on campus by 20%. What's your response? Act as the director of facilities on the university campus. You're going to raise parking costs. What's your response? And you get different perspectives. You can go and begin using it as a building block to analyze problems from different perspectives. And this is kind of a big thing that I have is I think that a lot of the problem with generative AI is that people have approached it as an answer generator. And it causes lots of problems. They go in and they ask it a question and they get an answer, and the answer is either perfect or imperfect, or they just accept the answer and they stop thinking. And this is the real risk, is this sort of intellectual laziness that it can create. But I think if we start changing how we use it to think about giving us perspectives on problems, then it can start actually being something that informs our thinking, not replaces it. And the simplest way you can do this, have it inform your thinking, is to never ask it for one of anything. You always ask it for many different options, because if you ask it for 3 options or 5 options, then you as the human being have to think about the options and which one is better and why. And then you typically will then go off in a different direction or combine best aspects of them, but then you begin thinking again. And I think it's a great, simple technique. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Every year we go camping with some family friends. Every year I try to cook a dessert on the fire, and every year I fail. So I brought this to ChatGPT this year. I'm camping with family in the woods. We have tinfoil, a skillet, and no other cooking tools other than fire. Give me 3 ways to bake a cake and compare and contrast the difficulty of getting the cake to turn out. And it comes back, okay, I can do method 1, tinfoil oven, method 2, skillet baking, method 3, Dutch oven substitute. And then it gives me a comparison of all the different techniques across a number of different dimensions. And suddenly what I've got is I've just learned a whole bunch of different ways that I could potentially bake a cake on a fire and what might be the attributes of different approaches. And I'm not getting just an answer anymore. Suddenly I'm getting something that informs my thinking. And it turns out we can use this in all kinds of interesting ways when we teach people to think in this way. And one of my favorite ways to use it is that everybody loves to talk about AI bias. The AI is biased. The AI is biased. How do you deal with AI bias? And I always say, look, the source of the AI bias is human beings. We are biased. We created the data that it was trained for, and that's where the bias in it comes from. The AI of old suffered tremendously from this bias, but the new AI we can use in interesting ways to actually help combat human bias. So a simple example is you give it data, and then you say, look at the data and generate 3 conflicting interpretations of it. And so you have the human confront totally opposing views of what the data means. And then the human has to think about it. And suddenly you can help the human potentially fight confirmation bias or what other type of bias they have, because they're now looking at different perspectives on the data. Or you go in and take a meeting transcript and you had a team that's meeting and you say, now identify 3 potential ambiguities for the team to discuss. And so like if you have a Zoom meeting and you take the transcript, now we can go and see like, well, let's not replace our thinking as a group, but what are things that we might need to talk about more? And let's make sure we're on the same page. It drives me nuts that like the end all be all use of generative AI right now in these meeting softwares is summarize. Like, I don't want to know like a summary of the meeting I just walked out of. I want something valuable. Like, tell me where we might have gone wrong. Or what are 4 possible questions the team should discuss and didn't? But my favorite one from a software engineering standpoint is one of the fundamental problems that we have in software engineering is we get teams of people to go and work on big problems, big software systems. And we'll have like one team go and work on the front end and one team go and work on the back end, 2 different parts of the software. And then at some point, these teams have to take the decisions they've made independently and make them work together. And this is the source of billions, at least, of dollars in wasted time and effort because teams go and work and they make independent decisions that don't mesh together. And when you integrate, it causes big problems. And now we can begin to do things that are leading in the direction of potentially solving problems like this. Here are the meeting notes from 2 teams addressing different facets of the same issue. Please identify 3 potential conflicting decisions. And then it can go and do an amazing job of looking at transcripts from separate conversations and identifying where they may be creating conflicts. Amazing, interesting thing, did not exist in computing before. Now, another really interesting thing is that this new computing has a very sort of different sense of what can be data. Like data before in my world was this very regimented, very structured, very, very like difficult to procure and clean thing. And if you didn't have data, you couldn't do computation with it. Data in this like rigid sense. And it turns out that in this new world of generative AI, data is a much, much more flexible thing. So to give you an example of this, we went out to eat, probably I think it was like a year ago when I did this with some friends. And my friend who is a lawyer told me that he'd never done anything with ChatGPT. He didn't think it was very interesting. And I felt bad for him because I wouldn't stop talking the rest of the night. And the first thing I did was I took this picture of the table and I said, who needs a refill? And I gave it to ChatGPT. And if you're, by the way, a computer scientist and you realize what a gigantically difficult computer vision problem this is, it comes back and it says, it looks like the glass with ice water is still fairly full, while the beer bottle seems to be nearly empty. So someone might want to refill on the beer soon. This is a tremendously difficult computation in the world of computing of the past. Because to do this computation cleanly, I would need data on what is on the table. What are the containers on the table? How much liquid does each container have? And they would all need to be in a structured format that I could then go and compute an answer to this. In order to perform this simple operation, who needs a refill? I'd have to translate this into some really set of low-level operations on a bunch of data that would be extremely difficult to get. And now all I do is I take a picture of the table and I say, perform the operation, who needs a refill? And then while I was sitting there, the waitress walked up and I hadn't decided on anything to order. So I snapped this picture of the menu and I said, I'm feeling indecisive and out of time. The waitress is here. Everyone is waiting on me. I need a quick keto option. And it comes back and it says, go for the grilled chili relleno with smoked chicken and sliced avocado. It's a keto-friendly option that's low in carbs and high in fats and protein. So it just basically performed a search on data that was a menu. There is no digital data for that menu. I simply grabbed a picture of it and said, you know, search for something that's keto friendly. And it performed the search for me on that data and gave me an answer. And this is a complete
How is it processing the image data?
directly in the model. You can just prompt with images and it converts it into tokens. And you can give it text and imagery seamlessly, and it fuses it all into tokens at the end of the day when it goes into the model and computes answers. So you can, and a lot of the models can also take, you know, video now, they can take audio, and they take all this multimodal stuff and do computation. It's wild. It's wild. Um, so I think that this transforms what we think about in computing and creates new ways of doing discovery of information and information access. And I want to go back and talk about that hallucination concept in a minute and the idea of creativity and computation, because I think this is going to be really important in these examples. So my belief is that if we did not have hallucination, if it was not a thing, if we didn't have the model get creative when there's not a clear answer, that we would lose a huge part of the value of generative AI. And so I'm going to show you an example of this. So I'm always trying to teach my son about generative AI because I want him prepared for this world and to think about how to use it, you know, to innovate and do new things. And so the other morning, we built this prompt together. And the prompt is, I'm going to take pictures of things. And whenever I take pictures of things, you give me a crazy, fun, totally unique new game that I could play with them.
And what happens is that when the interaction doesn't work as they expect, they will locally by themselves adapt knowledge at the issue of the interaction. And we perform a random simulation with a large number of games and eventually a large number of agents. And we try to observe the global property on the resulting knowledge and its evolution. So I will give an example of this. We have defined one kind of game which is based on a two-stage experimental protocol where we provide sample of the environment to an agent. It will learn an ontology, and it will use this ontology in order to interact with other agents. And the idea is that the agent together take a decision about an object of the environment. And of course, they do this many times. So the way it works actually here is that from the sample we learn this
question. I don't know if you're getting that audio on your side as well.
Just a second. Jean-Pierre. Jean-Pierre, coupe.
The object that is found, and adaptation is.
There we go.
I don't know how that happened. Sorry.
No problem. No problem. So the part that threw me is he's talking about games too. So I was like, I'm trying to understand the question. And then I realized, oh, wait, it's not a question. I gave this prompt to my son and he knew what to do with it. And he went and started assembling random sets of objects because his goal, of course, is always like, Dad likes this ChatGPT stuff too much. I'm going to try to break it. So he took this old wooden ship that we built together. He took a remote control and a bunch of wiffle balls in their boxes. And he's like, let's see what it does with that. And it comes back, remote control shuffleboard. Slide the boxes along the wooden plank to score points by landing in specific zones. And so then he went around collecting random assortments of interesting objects and toys and discovering all kinds of games he could potentially play with them, and then interacting and saying, well, what if we did it this way? And this is only possible when we have like hallucination and creativity. And he could go off and he could get in discovering all kinds of interesting things. Now, a more concrete and simple and practical example of this is probably useful to a lot of people is you come home at the end of the day, you have not planned your grocery shopping very well, and you're like, what am I going to eat? And I don't want to order out and spend the money and eat something unhealthy. So you gather the items from your pantry that you have left, put them on the counter, take a picture of it, and you say, this is all I have left in my pantry. Give me a dinner recipe. And it comes back, black bean and avocado salad with yogurt lime dressing. But it's also a more fluid discovery because you could also go back and say, but I don't want to use lemons, or I don't really want peanut butter in my avocado lime, whatever. and it will, as fluidly as you can do it, go and reshape it. Or I have this, food allergy. And it also begins to change how we think about accessing information or knowledge that we need to perform tasks in the real world. So this is a simple example where I snapped a picture of a coffee maker in a hotel room, and I said, explain to me step by step how to use this. And it comes back and gives me complete instructions on how to use this coffee maker. Now, if you think about it, there's like this scene in The Matrix where Trinity needs to save everybody by flying a helicopter, and she doesn't know how to do it. And they download the instructions into her brain, and then she goes off and flies the helicopter and saves everybody. And this isn't quite that, but it's heading in that direction. And I've used this to do all kinds of amazing things of helping me to diagnose problems and solve problems. Now, what's amazing about it is it's not just telling me how to solve the problem or giving me steps. So I took this picture of old sushi, and I said, give me step-by-step plans to make this. And it goes back with a complete list of ingredients, like salmon, cream cheese, nori, seaweed sheets, sushi rice, tells me step-by-step how to make it. But what's incredible is when you start going back to this idea of thinking in terms of conversation and iteratively solving problems, if I collect all the ingredients and I put them on the counter and I say, here's what I bought, what did I forget or get wrong? It can look and adapt and say, well, you bought Cabernet Sauvignon and cheddar cheese spread rather than cream cheese. You bought soy sauce, that's right. You bought yellow rice instead of sushi rice, and you bought roasted seaweed snacks instead of nori sheets. So it's not just that it can, but let's just take a moment to appreciate this. If all generative AI was take a picture of an arbitrary object and give me an approximation of how to make it, that would be the most revolutionary advance on the planet. And if you'd taken all the PhDs, all the supercomputing in the world, you put them together in a room, my belief is that before all this stuff came out, we could not have built a system to take a picture of an arbitrary object and approximate how to make it. And now we can create that system, and that's just one of a sort of infinite number of things we can do. But we can also build the system that when it tells us how to make it and we go and start working on it and we make a mistake, it can tell us how to adapt, or it can tell us what the next step is. Now I'm going to put all this together into two last examples, and I know I'm running a little bit late, and then I'll wrap up. So I want to give you an example of 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately, I had a really expensive repair at my house. And that repair was that my air conditioning units for my house went out. So here where I live, it gets very hot, and we noticed that our air conditioning wasn't working. And so we had a technician come out to our house. He told us that we have 2 units for the house. He told us that not only was the one that we were worried about broken, but the other one was also broken too. And it was going to be thousands of dollars to repair it. And he said, this is what your 2 options are. We can repair them. It'll be really expensive, or we can buy you new units, which is really, really expensive. And he sent me all these nice photos of him looking at our unit, which I know nothing about. And so I went, and just before I made my decision, I uploaded them to ChatGPT. And I said, what does this tell you about the old unit? And it comes back and it says, well, the field piece SC260 clamp meter is showing 13.30 volts, which is much lower than what you would expect in a properly functioning HVAC unit. And then it tells me a bunch of stuff about it and basically says you probably have a leak in this part of the unit. And then he had sent me this other picture of another piece of equipment that I knew nothing about attached to one of my units. So I uploaded it and I said, what does this show? And it says, well, the manifold gauge is showing low side pressure of 85.2. This is low for an R410A system under normal cooling conditions. Typical pressure should be 100 to 145, whatever that means. Goes through, basically tells me I probably have this leak. I took all the other pictures, I put them in. Basically, it went and dissected all those pictures and gave me roughly exactly what that technician had told me. Went through all of the things. I asked it about repairing the issue, how much it would cost. The cost pretty much aligned with what the guy told me. But the best part of it was at the end, the guy didn't tell me, here's what to do. He said, here's your options. And ChatGPT proactively at the end of all of this popped this out. And it told me, here's your decision criteria. If it's under 5 years old, you should have a warranty. If it's 6 to 10, it might make sense to repair it, but if it's more than 10 years old and my 2 units were 13 years old each, you should consider replacing them. And basically, that's what the guy had also kind of hinted at. and I ended up replacing my units. But if you start thinking about this, like this type of thing is going to start happening in the world around us. Like all of the experts that we're working with, we're going to have new ways of sort of like interacting with them, taking in knowledge. The type of effect that we saw when we had internet search, where people would go and Google the medical advice and the test results and the symptoms, we're going to start having a really, really broad version of this that's enabled by this new type of computing. Now, one of the other things that gets me really excited about this world is that this new world democratizes access to computing and innovation in computing in a really unique way. Like before, computing was something where you want to innovate in software, you go hire a software engineer to build something for you. Now you're not going to have to go to a software engineer in the same way anymore. And I want to give you an example of this. So the other day, I was talking to my son and I was looking and he had gotten another pair of shoes and I looked at him and I was like, buddy, you know what you need? And he's like, what? And I'm like, inventory management. He's like, what are you talking about, Dad? And I'm like, well, you were little, you would collect sticks and rocks. And then you got older and you started collecting Pokemon cards in the grocery store. And now you're older and you're collecting shoes. And I'm like, you need inventory management. You don't even know what you have. And he's like, oh no, I know what Dad's doing. It's ChatGPT. So we sat down and we built this prompt together, and it's inventory management in a prompt. Whenever I give you a photo, create an inventory of what I gave you with approximate price. Keep the inventory up to date as I add pictures. And then he went and took a picture of his Air Jordans, and it starts with the first inventory item. Item, Air Jordan basketball shoes, description, red colorway, and it goes on. Then he took a picture of his Vans biking shoes, and it comes back, item, Air Jordan basketball shoes, description, red colorway with iconic Jumpman logo, condition used, and approximate price. Then it goes item, Van skate shoes, description, black colorway. And in one prompt, we created in what many ways is arguably the most advanced inventory management system on the planet, because it can go directly from an image to an arbitrary set of criteria that I ask it to extract per item. It can keep the inventory up to date as he takes photos, and it's pre-baked with the ability to recognize like probably more objects on the planet than any other system. And what's amazing is we went to New York over the summer and we were in the Nike store and he picked up his shoe and it did not have a price on it. He's like, Dad, I really want these. And I'm like, buddy, it doesn't have a price on it. And it's so busy. I don't want to try to go find a person to give us help. And he's like, give me your phone, Dad. And I knew I'd failed because he took it out and he took a picture of it with ChatGPT and he said, how much is this? And it identified the shoe. This is a very new shoe, identified it, took us to the website with the price across a number of different vendors. And he's like, okay, now we're going to buy it, Dad. And I'm like, well, I guess we will because you did it with ChatGPT. But what this is showing is like, if I did this in software, this is years of work, teams of software engineers. And now we don't even need software necessarily. He just wrote a prompt and he has manifested a computational system that can track inventory in a super complex way. You start connecting it with as an AI agent to our existing systems and databases, and you get even more power out of it. But we're going to be moving into this world where suddenly it can manifest computing for us, like we saw at the beginning where it created the PowerPoint and all those visualizations, and it's translating my goals into a bunch of computations that it's executing and then give me the results. Or at the very beginning, when I created the educational software game, and I had a conversation, and then it manifested that in software that I could go install. But it also is going to take the form of just pure prompts where we've created an entire system, computational system, in a prompt. And now the conversation becomes that computational system, and he can collect the inventory in that conversation. And so it's going to reshape how we do computing, but who can innovate? Because anybody can go and start thinking about how do I build new systems with these technologies and capabilities. So to wrap up, I think where we've gone astray in a lot of cases is when we talk about this in terms of artificial intelligence, because it creates this sort of connotation of an artificial replacement for human intelligence. And it creates this gut reaction of like, I don't want that. I don't want to be replaced. I don't want all that. And I think what we really need to be talking about is augmented intelligence, that it's about how do we use this technology to amplify and aid human creativity and critical thinking in ways that allow the human to do new things, to solve bigger and harder and new types of problems, not to replace our thinking. And so I kind of think of it as like an exoskeleton for the mind. You put this on, you solve certain types of problems that are hard otherwise. You have to learn how to drive it effectively and how to use it. But at the same time, you have to learn how to take it off and not to let your muscles atrophy in this new world. But I think it's really exciting. I'm really excited about this vision of all the things that people can go and do and innovate with in computing because of the new capabilities it has and the new way we interface with it. So if you'd like to learn more about this, I teach a bunch of courses on Coursera on all kinds of things from agents to how to do data analysis with it to prompt engineering. And here's some of the links and also a link to my very first paper that I did in this space. So thank you so much. And I'd be happy to answer questions if we have time. I think we have plenty of time, but I'll...
Yes, we have time, and thank you ever so much. First, we want to thank you for having given us. And actually, it was much better than I expected.
Well, thank you.
Not that I had bad expectations, I wouldn't have invited you, but it exceeded the expectations. Now, we're ready for questions. I'm going to switch from virtual to local. There's already a local question. So can you see, wave your hand so you can, okay, there, yeah, okay, you'll see him in 2 images. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about specifically again with the it should be augmented intelligence and artificial intelligence. So still using normal understanding and hearing what the what GPT gave meant. But when you gave your previous example, the example for the current how to use that system and also for the conditioning unit, since you didn't have any frame of reference, like you said yourself, wasn't that pretty much just artificial intelligence? You can't do a reasoning about if it's right or not in that situation. Like for the Turing, let's say if it did have hallucination and when okay, put your hand into the power plug, technically speaking, if you don't have a frame of reference, you could do something that the hallucination itself is bad for you, without knowing it. So on your reconcile, it is giving me a new frame of reference, and I still need to apply all base logic, even though I don't know where it is I need to apply it.
Okay. Yeah, great question. So it's interesting because my thinking on this has evolved over time. So when I started off, my belief was you only benefit in the augmented intelligence space if you already have fundamental skills in it. That was my initial belief. And that was my argument until some people convinced me otherwise. And the first example of where somebody convinced me otherwise is basically they said, when you don't have any capability there at all, you weren't doing it in the originally, you're not replacing anything if it allows you to do something that you couldn't have done before. If the thing it's allowing you to do is of such value and so low risk that it doesn't hurt you if it's not perfect. And so the example they gave is there is one of the collaborators I have, he grew up in a rural part of Tennessee, and one of the people that he grew up with owns a small store that resells used appliances like refrigerators and things. And so his friend owned this store, and this is sort of this crazy story, but basically his friend owned the store and was struggling. And he went and he taught his friend how to use ChatGPT. And basically he's like, look, how do you do your marketing? And the guy's like, well, I put ads on Facebook Marketplace. And he's like, well, how do you do that? And he's like, I'm going to just write the ad and put it up there and take some photographs. And he's like, well, let's take your photographs and your ads to ChatGPT and ask it to help you optimize them. And then let's ask it to teach you the kind of principles of how to write the best ads. And so basically he went and he started analyzing all of his Facebook Marketplace ads and the imagery he was taking. And he got all this feedback from ChatGPT on how to produce better ads. And the result is that he went and started increasing his business substantially because suddenly his ads were popping up at the top of Facebook Marketplace searches because he didn't have the access to an understanding of SEO or search engine optimization on Facebook Marketplace at all before. And suddenly he had this capability and it gave him huge benefit. Now, if he got it wrong, like like the worst case was his ads wouldn't show up any higher than they were before. It wasn't like he was already, at roughly zero. And so this was the first time that I was like, that's interesting. But he had some basic knowledge there that he could go and look at it, and it's like, it's still English. It still makes sense. It hasn't, lied about the refrigerator. So he has some basic knowledge that there's not terrible mistakes. He doesn't know if the search engine optimization that it's doing is actually going to work or not because he doesn't have any skills there, but it's really low risk for him and huge benefit. And so the person argued with me on this, and they said that's augmented intelligence. It's giving him a capability that he didn't have before. It's not going to hurt him, and he doesn't need a base level of understanding to do something there. And then I think in the example of the air conditioning units, the problem I'm really solving is I'm trying to understand if the person and what they're telling me is roughly accurate, or do I need to go find somebody else and get a second opinion? And I think the probability in that case that it's going to tell me something that exactly aligns with what the technician is telling me based on the measurements and pictures of their instruments is very low if the person is wrong. And so I think like the fact that I'm taking these pictures and it's producing an answer that looks exactly like what that technician told me is a high indication that it's right. Now, before this, I would have probably just like said, okay, well, it looks very convincing. You give me all these images and I generally trust you. Please go and do it. But this is now creating a second layer of trust. It's basically giving me a confirmation. Either way, I'm not going to, I wouldn't go to ChatGPT and be able to put those instruments on the machines myself and then diagnose it myself and repair it myself. But this person bringing it to me and saying, this is my recommendation from you. Now I'm stuck with, well, what decision am I going to make? Is this person trustworthy in what they're telling me? And basically what ChatGPT is doing in this sense is giving me sort of a confirmation of my trust. Now, if it came out with something wildly different, then probably what I've done is followed up and said, well, give me questions that I can ask this AC repair person to better understand if this is the right decision. Give me specific questions I could ask or additional pictures I might ask for, or give me like the questions that I should ask along with their photographs that I can send to another person to get confirmation. So really what it's helping me with is the trust problem. So I think there's many problems where we don't have to have a base level of sort of expertise for it to provide profound low risk value for us in an augmented intelligence. I do think there's still ones where you do need expertise, but I'm not sure what domains they are because in many cases it's like the bar keeps going up and up on what it has to be. So software was always the one that I thought, well, even if ChatGPT can generate code for people, now the autonomous execution of code itself, that changes the game because it can do it on behalf of somebody. But like if somebody's going to generate code and try to run it themselves, I used to think, well, you can't do that unless you have some basic level of programming and understanding. And then my perspective was changed when we had somebody from Raymond James, the big investment bank or whatever, all they do. And they came and they said, one of the teams that did the best with ChatGPT was our real estate investment team. And the reason they did is because all groups were told, no matter what, you do not put any of our private confidential data into ChatGPT. And that was the end of it for most groups. And real estate did something different. They said, well, if we can't put our data into ChatGPT, what we can do is we can go get ChatGPT to write code that we bring in and execute against our data. And so what they did is the real estate team went and started using ChatGPT. They had no experience in coding. They started using ChatGPT to develop Python applications and JavaScript applications to do different types of visualizations and analyses for them, and to tell them and explain to them how it worked and how to run it. And then they would bring that back inside the corporate environment where they weren't allowed to do anything with ChatGPT, but they were allowed to bring the code in, and then they would execute the code against their data. And apparently that team went off. This is all word of mouth from my understanding. And they built themselves all these tools that they never would have had that they said changed the game for them. And so I used to think you have to have experience, expertise, but I think it's much less so than we realize in many, many different types of tasks and domains. And I wanted software to be one of those because, right, I want you to have to hire a computer scientist, but computer science is one of the domains where I'm not sure you're going to have a ton of expertise for most tasks in the future.
Good. We have more questions coming. I'll start. The first was you, then you, and then you. Who was the other person? Who's the third person? Yeah, voulu.
Je pensais qu'il y avait quelqu'un par là, mais il y a pas de souci.
Okay. So go ahead. Me? Yes, I'll turn this to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jules. I'm Dominic.
Wave your hand so he can see where you are. Okay.
Well, speaking of programming and being able to code, do you see an issue with future generations when it comes to relying on generative AI? I mean, I'm gonna give you an analogy. My generation, we've been told that we have less memory than the generation before because we grew up with Google, and whenever we don't know something, we Google it. So we don't have to increase our memory or use it. Don't you think that I don't know, in 20 years, since you won't have you won't have to code anymore and be able to program, and it's like we reverse. Before we had to be computer literate, and we had to understand the computer in a way, and now we are asking the computer to understand us. So do you see an issue for that?
Good question. Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting because I don't really see an issue of it at all because I've been doing this my entire career. So like what we do in computing is we're continually raising the level of abstraction so that we can focus on the details at higher and higher levels. And that's kind of been the goal. So, I never have seen I've never written machine instructions by hand. I've seen them, but I've never written machine instructions by hand, like really low level stuff. I've written assembly code like in a class 25 years ago or something when I was forced to do it. And then I never wrote assembly again because I write in a higher level language and then the compiler translates it into assembly. And I think what the analogy that I think of that's kind of appropriate is it's very similar to the compiler. Basically, the LLM is translating, what I've expressed as what the computation is supposed to be. The compiler translates it into assembly or whatever the thing is beneath it. Except now the compiler is a much higher level thing. It's an LLM and it's expressing, rather than structured instructions in a programming language, it's taking language and translating that into computation. Now, I think we run into the same problems that we have in software, and I don't think software engineers are going away anytime soon. But the same problem we have is like we think that we've expressed the problem correctly before any of LLMs were around. Software engineer gets there, they program it, they think they've expressed the problem correctly, but they can't fully understand, like, is it going to work or not? And when you go and run the system, you determine that it doesn't actually work, that there's all kinds of bugs and flaws. And so then we have to build testing, we have to iterate, and we have to do all this stuff. I think what we're going to see is exactly the same type of thing where you think you've expressed it correctly. It goes and does stuff. When it goes and translates into assembly code, I don't look at the assembly code to see if it's correct or not. I go and have it run the system, and then I determine if the system is functioning as I expect. Now, there's certain cases where we care more about doing it in different ways, but that's kind of roughly how it gets done for most cases. I think we're going to have something similar with the LLM. It's going to go and translate this into computation many different ways, and then we're going to have to go and test the systems to make sure they work. This is something that I think is going to be foreign to many people because they don't have, like, you think about, I'm going to use ChatGPT, it solved the problem for me, and they don't bother to do the statistical test on the data to see, did it solve it correctly? Software engineering, at least we teach whether or not people do it. We teach, like, you should build it, but then you got to go test it and make sure it's working correctly and think about the test cases. I think we're going to have to do similar types of things. But it's going to be a different world because it can also propose test cases and propose them in ways that we can look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense. And then we can do interesting things. So I think it looks very similar to the compiler and the raising of abstraction of languages over time. I do think that there are going to be certain types of capabilities that are lost. And I think computer science departments, I mean, what does it mean for us? We teach all these concepts in terms of code. Do we throw out code? You know, I don't think humans are going to be writing much code in 10 years, but are we going to be reading code? I don't know. So like, I think at the very minimum, we're going to need to shift our curriculum, for example, to focus on having people read and understand code, whether or not they can write it from scratch. You know, and we've already been pretty bad about teaching this to people because people go work in the industry and we teach them all this work, all these assignments where we teach them to write code. Then they get into their job, and most of what their job is reading all the code that all the other employees have written for the last 10 years before they showed up, and then trying to understand it in order to write small bits of code that integrate with it. So I think it's going to shift the types of skills that we need to emphasize and teach. Coding, I think we're going to teach reading it for at least the next 5 years. Beyond that, I don't know. And it's a weird world for me as a computer scientist.
Okay, good question, good answer. Now, not the end of the story. Now, another question.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really interesting. My name is Yasmin. Actually, I have been used the ChatGPT for generating dialogues in human science context. And I played with the prompts in the same way that you explained today, but I didn't know the words, the terms that you, like the pattern of, you mentioned them in the two references, and I saw them in today's presentation. My question is, what I found from my own experience that there is a little bit differences between the GUI ChatGPT and the API ChatGPT. And in such situations, if you want to use the ChatGPT to generate content, and the content is huge, some way like I need to provide me with, for example, more than 1,000 dialogue to make a data set from scratch, because I didn't find such data to make such a prediction. So the GUI gives me duplicate in the response. And then I decided to start playing and learn how to use that ChatGPT API. What I found is that the API is better in generating data that are huge data. It's not just make a conversation like a dialogue between me and like the persona pattern you emphasized today. So what I found that the API, you can fine tune the model, LLM model, and you can choose which model you want to generate the data. You can put parameters like the temperature, which controls the randomness, let's say, of the generated content. And also you can adjust the frequency penalty, adjust the presence penalty, a lot of parameters you can do in the API. So you will get more accurate results. And I validated the results I obtained, and I got by human expert, I validated them, and I found that API outperforms the GUI in not all the situation, as I said, in just situation when I want to create something from scratch, not like just one response, then response, etc. It's when you go beyond.
Question asked, go ahead, Jules.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically this is kind of that phenomenon where I was saying that ChatGPT is an AI agent, and the API is basically sending prompts fairly directly. I mean, we don't know exactly what they're doing behind the scenes, but fairly directly to the model, you know, and getting a response. The GUI is basically taking your input, but it's not sending it directly to the model. And one simple kind of test and example you can use to show this is you can say, create an image of something, and it will generate an image using DALL-E. If you go in and you say, you know, generate 5 numbers using Python, it will go and turn into that code interpreter mode, and it will generate code, execute it, and get the result back. And so the GUI is actually acting as an agent, and it's being provided with tools. And so the prompting for it is different. And we don't know exactly what the sort of like architecture is of that prompting of that agent behind the scenes, or how they've set it up. And it also is going to have some system instructions of some kind that we can't really, I don't think they publish them right now, but different people have like reverse engineered them. I think Anthropic publishes theirs, but I don't think OpenAI does, if I remember correctly. But like there's system instructions that they're mixing into your prompt that you're not seeing. They're also doing sort of more agent-based things behind the scenes, and all those things, when they come together, the result is that it's not exactly the same as if you go directly with the API. Most like probably the thing that's affecting you the most is the system instructions that they are using behind the scenes for the GUI are different than what you're using with the API. And I think they, have things around, all kinds of things that you would expect around like not doing things that are, have certain characteristics to them. And the API is probably more open-ended. So I think that's probably where the difference is. I can't remember if they publish their system instructions or not. You can then put the system instructions potentially in, if they do, into the API to try to more closely mimic, but I think it's going to be hard to exactly mimic because of that.
Follow-up?
Yeah, actually, I
Short.
okay. Actually, I try to mimic. I got what I want from the API, but I really designed the structured prompt, and I created them in such a way in Python code, like it's like like a dictionary. I put keys, and then I asked them by code to put the output in Excel file, like you did in the GUI, but with the API. So I think we will get the similar results, but I mean, we can reduce the duplicates by using the API in some situations. This is my point that I would like to emphasize and take your opinion about it. That it's from my experience, I found that API is better in situations that for long, let's say, tokens, or when you want to something long, not like just short responses. I think API is better.
Janas, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think I maybe missed what the question was. Is the API better for longer things? I think it's very hard to know what's better for which. I think that the short version of it is that they are different because like the GUI is consumer based. Typically, it has a certain pricing model, which is per user per month, roughly as much as you can use. And so they do a number of things on the conversation that we can't see. One, to protect their economics, like in terms of like, we give it a big document, it may not actually consider the whole document. It may do some type of compression or some other interesting trick. So if we have a very long conversation, it may start summarizing the conversation behind the scenes in order to save token costs on input, or it may start using token caching. And so we can't see all those things that they're doing. And because we can't really fully see what they're doing, it's really hard to know which one is better for which. In your task that you're kind of, explaining, I would assume the API would be better because you get more control and you can ensure that it has like the full context window for whatever you're sending it, but it's hard to know for certain. And I think it just comes down to, we don't know exactly what they're doing behind their GUI.
Good. Next question. Can you see the hand?
Yes.
Okay.
We saw that we can use ChatGPT or
Very
Gen.
loud.
Oh,
Very loud.
we saw that we can use ChatGPT or Gen AI for different tasks. At what point do you think it will be a risk for human to be too dependent on it, when or if it not will be available?
That's a great question. Well, I think I think we're already at a point where it's a risk to us if computers aren't available in many cases. So, I mean, cyber attacks are a problem because, like, we've had Nashville has a lot of healthcare and a lot of hospital companies here in Nashville. And, some of them have been hit by cyber attacks where it takes down all their computer systems and becomes a huge issue because now they can't get access to data about patients in order to make appropriate decisions. And so I think we're already at the point, where like we've built computer systems and software far enough that we're super reliant on it in all kinds of ways, and it creates problems. And I think we're going to see exactly the same thing with generative AI and a lot of these systems, to where certain tasks, certain types of things we become so reliant on it that if we don't have it, it becomes a problem. Now, for me, like there's so many examples for me personally, but like a simple example is I was out in California visiting a company, and I had brought my phone. I used Google Maps to get me to that company for the day. I had a rental car. We went to dinner. One of the people from the company rode with me from their offices to dinner to help me find it. And then we got there, and then during dinner, my phone died, and I walked out, and everybody's like, "Bye," and everybody left. I got back to the car, and I took my phone out, and my phone was dead. And it was that moment that I realized I'm completely dependent upon my phone for directions. I have no idea how I got here. I have no idea how to get back. I can't go to a gas station anymore and buy a paper map of the area. I don't know how I'm going to get back. And so my solution was I had to take my laptop out of the car, thank goodness, and charge my phone off the laptop in order to get Google Maps and get back. So I think it's going to be no different from those types of things. Like there's so many things that we're already totally dependent on. And it's just going to be individual based on usage and or not usage and these types of things.
Okay, it's not over. I have a couple of questions too. One second, I'm going to show my face. One sec. So terrific talk. I wanted, where's my, one second, no note sheet. I wanted to ask four short questions on four topics. Number one, augmented intelligence. Yes, of course, that's a good expression, but of course, it changes the subject. We were asking how intelligent it was, and now you're talking about our intelligence being augmented.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, that's just a comment. This is my ignorance, but I do not know how powerful your image to text gimmick was. I mean, it sounds too good to be true. That obviously doesn't work for anything that you can make into an image. What are its constraints?
Well, it's remarkably good. And the constraints are, I think they're not fully known, but certain types of things. So I'm trying to, I want to show well, I don't know if I can find it fast enough.
You can.
I've got an example that's like when I was really trying to push it, that is really sort of like way farther out than I would have thought it could go. Let's see if I can find my image in the next 2 seconds. If not, I'll give up and describe it. But I can tell you one area where it's not good. So if you go and you take a picture of an aisle in a grocery store, and you say, tell me every product that's on the aisle, it's not going to do that task well. It's going to do like probably like 60 or 70% of the products right. And then it's either going to miss a lot of stuff or typically hallucinate what it thinks is there. And so like a lot of tasks where you have like in my inventory example, it works well because it's got like a small number of objects in the scene. And I don't know if this is just like, I assume this is something related to how the training set was put together, that there's not a lot of like labeled imagery with like thousands of products on an aisle or hundreds of products on an aisle, but that's one weakness that it has. On the other hand, and I can't find the example, so I don't think I'll be able to show it. I have a great image that I put into ChatGPT when I was really testing it, and it was like finger puppets that you could buy off Amazon. You put the little puppets onto your fingers, and they were made of silicone. And when you put all the puppets on, it looked like a squirrel. And basically, I asked ChatGPT how many squirrels were hurt in the making of this image. And what it says was, it's likely that no squirrels were harmed in the making of the image. The image shows finger puppets. Finger puppets are made from silicone, which wouldn't hurt, any animals. And so like, or you can go in and you can give it an image of a hospital room with a patient and people crowded around the bed. And you can say, is the patient's family visiting? And you can say yes, and it can do it extremely well. You can go in and you can say, is there a patient in the room? You can say, is the nurse in the room? Is an infusion pump in the room? Are there hazards in the room? And you can do things. Now, when you start getting it to like prompting it for like hazards or like dangers, this is one where I think that like it takes a lot of tuning of the prompt because it wants to find problems, right? Like how do you tell it to look at the room in like a reasonable way? It's a really hard thing. So like some of the things like, you know, big aisle with products doesn't do well because it's just, I think, I don't know what the reasoning, what happens behind the scenes that cause it to break down, but it doesn't give you a perfectly accurate thing, you know, list of the objects. You know, other things are like you ask it a question related to the image, but like it's hard to tune it to do it in a way that's reasonable. So like it always wants to find safety hazards, things like that, or like, and so those types of things, I think I would say it doesn't necessarily work well because it's overly, or it takes a lot of tuning to get it to say, like, analyze it in the way that you really want it to, as opposed to like being the inspector who finds a problem on everything.
Okay, we've run out of time. The last one's a one-liner. Do you think that the polymodal stuff solves the symbol grounding problem?
No.
Why? Oh, no, I can't ask you. Okay, thank you. That was absolutely excellent. And I hope you'll come back next week because it's also a prompt talk and it's going to be about scientific aspects. So you were more on the commercial and everyday uses side. That'll be on scientific uses and that might be
okay. Yeah, I'll take a look for the link. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.